Psalm 87 is another of the Korach Psalms. And one of the features of these Psalms of Korach is a love of Zion. We saw just last week Psalm 84 extolling the sanctuary and the longing to go on pilgrimage. Psalm 46 refers to Jerusalem as the city of God. Psalm 48:3, these are all Korach Psalms, of which there are, I believe, 11. Fairest of sights, joy of all earth. And so today, Psalm 87 is entitled, Loving is Adonai of the gates of Zion. It's a short psalm. Let me pull it up and I will read it, and then we'll go back through it more slowly to gain a sense of its flow and message. Now, first, let us all get kind of literally on the same page by the reading of Psalm 87. Of the descendants of Korach, a psalm song. Its foundation is in the mountains of holiness. Loving is Adonai of the gates of Zion than of all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are spoken of you, city of God, Selah. Let me recall Rachav and Babylon among those who know me. Behold, Philistia and Tyre, along with Cush. This was born there. And of Zion it is said, this person and that person were born in her, and God establishes her, the Most High. Adonai will record in the writings of peoples, this one was born there, Selah. And they, singing is whirling, all my wellsprings are in you. Now this short psalm is very purposely constructed, as I'll go over with you. And part of that purposefulness is ambiguity in terms of, we've seen this before regarding pronouns. Is it a small h for he or a capital H, meaning God as the he? For instance, here in verse 4, let me recall. Is it God doing the recalling? Is it a capital M? Or is it Jerusalem speaking? In this translation, I begin with the word loving is Adonai. Usually, it's translated as Adonai loves the gates of Zion. To do it as loves is more, if you will, active. Loving is the participle, the verb made into an adjective noun. But in fact, grammatically, according to Benjamin Siegel, one of Jeremy Siegel's neighbors, Benjamin Siegel, who's more adept at Hebrew grammar than I, points out that ohev is a participle, right? So it's the loving form rather than the act of love, which then comes full circle to sharim, kecholalim, as also participles, meaning singing as whirling. And so that's part of the frame, this quality of how the verb is chosen. And again, it's in this unpacking of the structure that you see the poetic complexities and artfulness of the psalm. Robert Alter, an important literary analyst, he will say, he brings this eye of what does the editing process look like, because the editing of psalms can again be medieval, as much as 1,000 years afterwards, in terms of the numbering of psalms, for instance. He says that 1b, its foundation is in the mountains of holiness. Is part of a triad. He reads it as, actually, here's another example. Yesudato, it's not clear who is being referred to, meaning, is it its foundation, which is the place of writing? Is it God's foundation, is in the mountains of holiness? Or is it the temple's foundation or Zion's foundation? So again, there's a lot of the pronoun in this psalm that allows for complexity. Back to Robert Alter, he does this as his foundation is in the mountains of holiness. Loving is Adonai of the gates of Zion as part 2, then of all the dwellings of Jacob as part 3. He calls it a triadic line. When we see the word Selah, which occurs twice in this psalm, the end of verse 3 and the end of verse 6, that's a division. That might have been earlier by the earlier scribes marking musical notation. Again, Nachum Sarna, the professor of Brandeis, identifies Selah as a drum sound, like Sal is a basket, so it's a boom. Others say it's simply musical notation more generally. Some translate Selah as forever. Bottom line, it's a divider. And so that means verses 1 to 3 is a unit, verses 4 to 6 is a unit, quite symmetrical. And then verse 7 is, if you will, the punchline. So back to the beginning. Its foundation is in the mountains of holiness. Now, mountains refers to Jerusalem and the temple. And again, we're not sure if the it here is God or the temple or Jerusalem itself, but the temple would be founded on Mount Moriah, by extension, Mount Zion, and even in the time of the first temple, Mount Olives across the valley constituted that sense of the holy space. And so it's in the plural, not just necessarily the immediate location of the temple. And now, verse 2, loving is Adonai of the gates of Zion, then of all the dwellings of Jacob. An expression that Jerusalem, Zion, which is where the temple is, that mount, is more precious, more dear to God. And again, it's the Yud He Vav He. It's the God of intimacy, the God of relationship of the Jewish people, than the rest of Israel. So although Israel is holy to God, even more so is the location of Jerusalem, where the Holy Temple would be built. Even more dramatically, as will be seen in this psalm, the Even Shtiyah, that's the word in Hebrew for the cornerstone of all of creation, according to the Talmud, Yoma 55b, is the stone was underneath where the Holy of Holies would be, which is to say that all of creation itself for God emerges from Jerusalem. It's the center of the world. And you can remember those medieval maps where Jerusalem is at the center of the world. This psalmist, we don't know when it was written or who wrote it. I mean, it's entitled The Descendants of Korach. Here's another interesting thing in terms of a classic commentary in that regard. This psalm is extolling Jerusalem as being more precious than any other place in Israel, let alone the world. And a classic commentator, now going forward in time quite a while, noted in Art Scroll but without attribution, will say that Korach, he's the rebel against Moses, Moses' cousin. He's the son of the tribe of Reuven. No, well, Korach, Bottom line, Korach is the rebel, erase the Ruvain piece. He will rebel, and he will say, Moses, who lifted you up above all of us? We're all holy. Meaning we're all equal. You shouldn't be telling us more about what God has to say. So the medieval commentator will say, the sin of Korach was failing to recognize that Moses was lifted up above Israel as the leader. And by their own repentance in this psalm, they acknowledge that Jerusalem is lifted up above the other places in Israel, which is to say, yes, Moses too could be singled out as Jerusalem is singled out. Well, that's homiletical, but kind of lovely. Verse 3, glorious things are spoken of you, city of God. I capitalize city of God, at least the city piece. Usually it's a small c, because city of God is another name of Jerusalem. And when they say glorious things are spoken of you, that could mean many things. It can be that is where there are psalms written about you, where people honor you. One classic commentator will say, because this is here, the you is sometimes small y, sometimes capital Y. So glorious things are spoken of you, meaning God, in the city of God, in Jerusalem. For some, points to the only time that God's name, the Yud He Vav He, was pronounced, and that was on Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies. So glorious things are spoken of you with a capital Y is another possibility. So that's first section. The first section, and then you see Selah, is about the glory of Jerusalem and God's love, distinctive love for this holy city, the city of God. And now this next section, and here's something to be understood poetically. Verse 4 and verse 6 have the same quote. This one was born there. And in between, verse 5 has an uncertainty. Does it come to summarize verse 4 or to contrast? Meaning, is this, when it talks here in verse 4 about other nations, are they being separate from the people of Jerusalem, or are they the people coming to Jerusalem? We'll see that in a moment. But the key phrase is Ze Yulad Sham. This was born there. And again, is the there being abroad, or is the there being born in Jerusalem? You'll see the ambiguity. Here's the parts to know. Let me recall Rahab. Rahab is widely understood by the commentators as Egypt. Isaiah 51:9, as an example, uses Rahab to refer to Egypt. Elsewhere in Psalms, it's like in 40 verse 5, used to refer to those who are wide, expansive, i.e. the arrogant. But most in this context will see it as Egypt and Babylonia, which are the great superpowers in ancient Israel, one to the south, one to the north. And then for geographical diversity, Philistia is west coast. That's along the coast. Tyre is in the north. And Cush is the biblical name for either Ethiopia or some say parts of Saudi Arabia, meaning to Israel's south. So here in verse 4, what we have is examples of the two superpowers and then a bigger world. So who's speaking? Again, not clear if it's Jerusalem speaking, if it's the member of the city of Judah who is speaking, or if it is God speaking. Let me recall Rachav and Babylon among those who know me. So now a capital M, and I do seem to need to go back and reconcile the small m and the large m. That's the process of translation. Behold, Philistia entire along with Cush. And then this quote that this is what he's ruminating of. This was born there. And again, is the there that these are people who were born abroad? Or is he referring to people who are in Jerusalem already, who were coming? And meaning, is this a pilgrim song? And now two possibilities. Either Jews are spread out all over the world and the author is writing about pilgrims, acknowledging that pilgrims have come from all over the world to Zion. Or is this, which is a medieval understanding, more messianic? Because we've seen this trajectory that the whole world will one day come to Jerusalem. So is this written, again, that ambiguity, by a psalmist in Jerusalem looking at pilgrims, or is this a psalmist writing about the future? And now the middle of these two frames. And of Zion it is said, this person and that person were born in her, and God establishes her, the Most High. Again, ambiguity. This person and that person. This can be understood in a variety of ways. Ish v'ish. Again, it can be this person who was born in Jerusalem and that person who is a pilgrim are each treated as if they were born in her. In fact, the Talmud would say regarding Ish v'ish, Ketubot 75a, that it refers to both the native born and those who yearn to live there. So in the question, who can say that Jerusalem is their home, their place? It can either be the person who lives in Jerusalem, who even was born in Jerusalem, but it can also be the person who longs for Zion. This and this are as if born there. This person, that person were born in her. And I use her to refer to Jerusalem because it's often translated in Hebrew, it's ambiguous. Yechoneneha. Ha can be her or it can be it. Because in Hebrew, there isn't a pronoun for it as such. Things take on a male or a female dimension. But in our tradition, Jerusalem has this quality of being a living being, a lover. God loves Jerusalem. The people of Israel yearn for Jerusalem as a lover. And so the choice of translating it, as some commentaries do, as her. This person was born in her Jerusalem. God establishes her. And then the Most High, ambiguity, can either refer to Jerusalem or it can be referring to God who establishes her. So you can see in a very short psalm, lots of ambiguity and probably intentionally this mixing of God, the city, the people, as who the pronouns are referring to is part of the message of the psalm itself. Verse 6, Adonai will record. Yispor can also be will count. Bichtov amim, in the writings of peoples, often translated as in the Chronicles or in the census of peoples. But literally, it's the writings. This was born there. Now here too, It's the frame, right? Verses 4 and 6 each have this phrase, Ze yulad sham, this was born there. And then with 5 in the middle, this person and that person were born in her, and God establishes her, the Most High. Adonai will record in the writings of peoples, this one was born there. So 6 could either be messianic. Now again, here regarding Hebrew grammar, there's perfect and imperfect. This is imperfect, meaning present or future. So some translations will say Adonai records in the writings of people. This was born there. But it's often understood as pointing to the future. Hence, will record in the writings of people. This was born there. Once again, kind of a messianic undertow or dimension of the words. And all the more messianic, perhaps, at least as it's widely read, with the following conclusion. And they being either the residents of Jerusalem or the pilgrims of Jerusalem or the whole world, because back to this image of verse 4, the whole world is recognized, and perhaps B'yom hahu Adonai echad u'shmo echad, on that day, Zechariah, they will know that there is one and his name is one, meaning God. So again, we're not sure who the they is, though it's in the plural and it's a particle. Singing as whirling, sometimes translated as and singers and dancers. But the literal Hebrew, because lirkod is the more common word for dancing. The other play with cholalim is it's the same for chalil. Some of you may have gotten a recorder as a child and know that David had a chalil, the shepherd. And so some will translate it as and singers and flautists, because cholalim can also have that dimension. And they are celebrating in Jerusalem. And here is what they are singing. All my well springs are in you. Now, well springs could mean all the sources, the fountains of praise emerge from you. All my song emerges from you. All my words emerge from you. And yet there are 3 possibilities as to what this obscure term Mayane, here I'm choosing well springs. I choose it for that is Ibn Ezra and Radak's understanding based on Ma'ayan. Ma'ayan is a fountain, a wellspring, but Radak sees it as a Naim. All eyes are on you, which means everybody's looking toward Jerusalem. Or Rashi and Radak also will say, no, its root is iyun, that all study of Torah emerges from you. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. From Zion comes Torah. By the way, the word Sion, which we see here in verse 2, in the Talmud in Brachot 8a, written in Babylonia, will do a word play, and they'll say Sion is mitsuyan, excellence. And wherever there is the study on the highest level, like the academies of Babylonia, that is Zion too. That is a place that is mitsuyan, excellent in tapping the well springs of Torah. So let me pull this together in terms of kind of a analytical piece of this psalm to be now with closing thoughts in terms of its emotional content. I have an image. I began with Shelby, our honoree today, having the privilege of spending a year in Israel. I was the same age then as Shelby when I started if you will, kind of a gap year, but in fact, it was my first year of college. In my case, it was 72 to 73, living on Mount Scopus. And I have this vivid emotional memory of going to the airport at the end of my first year away from home, having been a student at Hebrew University, living in the dorms on Mount Scopus. And as I was beginning to pull away from Jerusalem, it was early in the morning, it was about sunrise, the clouds were at the base of Jerusalem. And so as we pulled away, Mount Scopus was sitting on a cloud. And my eyes welled up with tears. I can still feel goosebumps as I'm telling you the story. I was in love with Jerusalem and leaving. I would return, by the way, that following year to continue at Hebrew University. But the experience of a city being a love for me, of being in love with a place, I've only experienced in that case and in other times for Jerusalem. And that is the mood here of Psalm 87. It's a lover's psalm. Jerusalem is that which God loves more than any other place, even in Israel, let alone the world. It's the center of the heart of connection. But more, what this psalm also answers is that question. And I see again Jeremy, you don't have to have been born in Jerusalem for it to be your home, and more. This is a pilgrim's perspective, perhaps, which is you don't even have to live in Jerusalem for your heart to long for it and for it to be an emotional center in your life. So with that, I now turn off the text to see and harvest 18 screens, a good number, good Jewish number of celebration. Some of your reactions as we honor today Shelby in this learning. And I have somebody born in Jerusalem with her hand up, born and living on Alfasi Street in Rehavia, Cantor Shula.
That's right. That's exactly what I wanted to say. Jerusalem is my hometown. I was born there. And so even though you say that there are various possibilities of the authorship and the meaning, I can't help but feel almost the vibe of Jerusalem of gold, Yerushalayim shel Zahav. And in that song, everything that is said about Jerusalem that is wonderful, the first person is actually the poet herself there. It happened to be the lady who wrote it. And I attribute personally, that was Nomi Shemer, right? I personally therefore think that every first person here, and that is strictly my own feeling, I am no scholar at all, but this is my own feeling, that when there is a first person like Azkir, that is me, the poet, saying, I am reminding, not God speaking or Jerusalem speaking or whatever. I see this as a love song by the Tehillim poet to Yerushalayim. And when it says, Ohev Adonai Sharei Tzion, he's talking in the third person about Adonai, saying Adonai loves the gate of Tzion, etc., etc. So I personally have decided that this is the poet's own love song to Jerusalem.
So in that regard, I'll share in this line, verse 4, let me recall Rachav and Babylon among those who know me. Most of the translations have it as a capital M, meaning God. Benjamin Siegel, I'm going to double check it to challenge myself because I'm inconsistent. But Robert Alter echoes Shula. Namely, Robert Alter sees the speaker as Jerusalem, and not the speaker. There's three possibilities in terms of who's doing the recalling, because it's referring to me. It can either be, Shula says, the poet. It can be God speaking. It can be Jerusalem speaking. And we've seen this voice of Jerusalem. If you look in the book of Lamentations, Echa, Jerusalem speaks about her exiles. So again, Jerusalem as lover is personified in many places. But I'm identified, Shula, with your relating to it as the psalmist. And again, it's wonderful to have a Yerushalmi, somebody from Jerusalem, feel her own voice being echoed here.
Born on Mount Scopus, I might add.
Hadassah Hospital,
Yes.
a good place, a noble
Yeah.
beginning. Yeah. All right. So another comment about Psalm 87. Anything that struck you in hearing and reading it? Alex, in honor of your wife. Go ahead, Alex.
I have a grammar question. The last word, Bach.
Yes.
What gender is that?
So it's in the feminine, Bach, instead of Bech. But but here's the thing, actually, cities are usually in the feminine in Hebrew. So it's in the feminine, but once again, the punctuation, the vowels come much later, and therefore there's always room for ambiguity. But in this case, the you of the Bach, in you or of you, is the feminine.
So that would mean in Jerusalem.
Yes. But again, back to the ambiguity that I shared, that glorious things are spoken of you, meaning of God, with that medieval commentary that what's spoken is God's intimate name. In our tradition, God is referred to both in the masculine and in the feminine, in terms of Shechina, as an example. And in fact, Mishkan, the temple identification of God's presence, is this quality of God's feminine dimension as well. So as poetry, part of the nature of poetry is ambiguity, for the powerful reason that you can say more thing than one thing at a time. So again, the ambiguity here is purposeful. This is written, if you look again at verse 6, where there is this framing of this one was born there, with the in between being this person and that person were born in her, and God establishes her. This, again, poetically is very purposefully constructed, and part of that purpose is precisely to convey this intertwining of God, the speaker, and the city. And isn't that kind of beautiful? The notion that the three are intertwined: God, the speaker, and the place.
Oh, yeah. One more thing.
Yes, Alex.
Rahab was a synonym for Egypt. And
yes.
It's kind of interesting that Egypt should be known both as Mitzrayim, a place of constraint, and Rahab, a place of expanse.
Yeah, and at the same time, here I'll give you 4 different sites where Rachav in the Bible is identified with Egypt. Isaiah 51:9, Psalm 89:11, we'll see that next week, Job 9:13, and Job 26:12. Now, that may again be Egypt was seen as a big place. So Rachav, though the word Rachav is also used in one other place to be a sea monster, like a crocodile, and that Egypt is identified with the crocodile as the Nile. Sure. So that may be another source rather than expansive place. There is at least one place in the Bible where Rachav, we saw this I think earlier in Psalms, is a river monster, and it's the symbol of Egypt. Some say it's the crocodile, some say it's the hippopotamus.
But wasn't Rahab a woman? Wasn't she a character in early Israel?
It's
living in the wall.
It's in the book of Joshua, where Rachav is where the spies are finding shelter, but not in this context. In terms of an individual, again, you can, in that case, Rachav, the woman, was a prostitute. Also, kind of perhaps a word play in terms of the meaning of and her profession. So, in sum, in reference to your question, Alex, although we think of Mitzrayim as narrow, the word Mitzrayim literally is tsar because it's a country along the Nile, dependent on the Nile for irrigation rather than rain. I've seen this in an airplane. If you go over Cairo, it's all along the Nile, the water source, rather than Rachav, wide, because it's dependent on the Nile. But yet, in repeated places, Rachav, to answer Alex's question, equals Egypt as well. So with that, is there a closing comment? And then I'm going to pull this together and then we'll do Kaddish and a closing word of Shelby's, if she'd like. So let me pull it together. This is a short psalm, a psalm of Korach, as we've seen in other places, at least 3 other psalms attributed to Korach. Korach is a lover, or this, if you will, this brand of psalm is a lover of the temple and Jerusalem. And this short psalm is a tight weave with 3 parts. The first is how God loves Israel. The second part is pilgrims, whether born in Israel or coming to Israel, are as if born in Jerusalem. At least that's how I choose to read it. I will add, some of the medieval commentators will say ish ve'ish is that Jerusalem produces many remarkable people. So they'll just see it as an ode to Jerusalem rather than answering the question that Martin Cohen, among others, and I see as being answered, and that is, in observing pilgrims, are they of the place or not? Israel uniquely, and Martin Cohen points this out, is a land of pilgrimage. Abraham and Sarah came there. They were not native born. And throughout history, Jerusalem was a center of pilgrims, and they were as if native to the city. And then the closing line, either a description of the pilgrims in the moment of pilgrimage or pointing to the future, singing and whirling and proclaiming, all my well springs are in you. And back to Alex's question, the in you is in the feminine and therefore understood as Jerusalem, but can also be understood as in God. And it is in the city of God that is the foundation of creation itself, God's city, the city of God, that we experience and celebrate God. And so with that, in celebration of Jerusalem, in celebration of singing and whirling, I invite those saying Kaddish to have this opportunity to honor loved ones as we recite Kaddish together. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah.
Amen.
Alma divrat kirotei v'yamlich malchutei. B'chayechon u'vyomechon u'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala u'bizman kari v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi
Yehi
shmei
Shmei
Rabba
Rabba Mavorach
Le'olam
Le'olam
U'mei
Omei Omaya Yiparach.
Yiparach v'yitavach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata damiran bioma viruame.
Amen.
Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'kol Yisrael viru amen.
Amen.
Ose shalom
Shalom.
b'momav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru
Amen.
amen. Next week will be Psalms 88, 89, and 90. And I'll point out there are 10 different authors ascribed to Psalms. One of them is Moses, Psalm 90, next Thursday. So in this case, I thank each of you. But before we go, I just want to give Shelby voice if you'd like to have a concluding sentence or two.
I think this is a perfect psalm dedicated to me. I'm honored because I did live in Israel and visited Jerusalem. And I'm keeping all of your, I'm printing out the psalms and keeping my notes, because when we're finished, I want to read a psalm a day and continue doing this when we're finished with all of 150.
Thank you, Shelby. Well, that's the goal. The goal is to keep going. Each of you put wind in my sails for continuing this long journey through Psalms. And like today, I continue when I go deeply into learning the Psalms, see the artistry in the composition and have therefore greater connection to the Psalms. Shelby, thank you for agreeing to be honored. To Cantor Shula Mazal Tov on Shira, your granddaughter. To each of you, gratitude. Have a good day.